In 1995, the United States ended a war in the Balkans. Fighting in Bosnia over 3 years had cost 100,000 lives. Almost half the population, 2 million people, were displaced as a result of what was then called ethnic cleansing. And in July 1995, Bosnian Serb forces killed in cold blood some 8,000 Bosnian men, young and old, after the fall of the enclave of Srebrenica, supposedly a UN safe haven. Then, however, in July, stung by the humiliation to the international community and worried about the credibility of NATO and the UN, shamed by 3 years of campaign in favor of intervention by international human rights groups and media, and shocked by the latest example of mass atrocities, the United States decided to act. On 17th of July, the Clinton administration and the White House adopted what it called an endgame strategy, envisaging strong-armed, aggressive US diplomacy and threatening to bomb the Bosnian Serb forces from the air. A few weeks later, the US and its allies started bombing. A few weeks after that, the parties agreed to a peace agreement on a US Air Force base in Dayton, Ohio. And by the end of the year, 60,000 international peacekeepers were deployed to Bosnia. The war was over. This was a major turning point in the international debate on intervention. Many people had said for years, after all, that this would be impossible to do, that ending the fighting was beyond the power of outsiders. And many continue to say this even in 1996, that in the end, Bosnia was likely doomed to return to fighting. The US role after the war remained, after all, limited. As President Clinton put it in a speech to the US public in November 1995, US troops will maintain the ceasefire to prevent a war from accidentally starting again. This was a limited agenda. There was no conscious policy of regime change. The man most responsible for the Balkan tragedy, Slobodan Milosevic, the leader in Serbia, and also Franjo Tudjman, the president of Croatia, had not only been in Dayton, but were also now supposedly guaranteeing the implementation of an agreement in a state that both of them had done much to undermine. Their nationalist proxies remained in Bosnia, in Pale for the Serbs and in Mostar for the Croats, and 3 armies continued to exist. The US, in turn, was committed to arm the Bosnian army as a way of balancing the strength of the Serbs and having an exit strategy for the future. This did not look to many people like a recipe for a stable state and a stable peace, and many predicted disaster once the United States would withdraw its troops. However, a second time, the skeptics were proven wrong. When US troops did leave Bosnia in 2004, more than 1 million people had returned to their homes, 200,000 properties had been restored to those who lost it during the conflict. There had been a massive demobilization from more than 400,000 men under arms in 1996 to a professional army of around 10,000 people. The peace has been in place since Dayton for now more than 16 years, and throughout this whole period there had been 0 loss of life for the US and its allies. So what are the real lessons from this experience? The most important one is that there does seem to be a clear answer to the question that Rory Stewart and myself are asking in this book: can intervention work? Yes, it can, because it did. But beyond this general lesson, that it is actually sometimes possible to do good, is the specific question of what specific, hands-on, practical lessons for policymakers are. Under what conditions can intervention work? What does it really take for success? Was Libya, is Syria today like Bosnia in 1995? And what do we make of the experiences, much more paralyzing and tragic, of interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, which followed? Now let me present 2 types of lessons from the Balkans, 2 schools of thought about intervention which have been incredibly influential in the past decade, and which I also believe, and argue in the book, have led us to some misleading conclusions. Let me suggest then finally a more modest set of lessons from the Balkans, a different way of thinking about intervention that does not paralyze outsiders, but also does not lend us in impossible missions with impossible mandates. Now, the first school of thought that I want to discuss, we refer to it in our book as the planners. It is a group of people most prominently represented by the most important American think tank, the RAND Corporation, and a project run by James Dobbins, who has extensive practical hands-on experience in the US administration dealing with places throughout the world that have seen intervention. Now, the planners argue in a series of case studies that it is first vital to study past experience closely, and secondly, that it is possible to extrapolate from past experiences to learn for the future. The key to success, the RAND studies find, is the amount of resources and the quality of the planning that precedes the mission and the resources that are deployed over a period of time. The difference between success and failure, one of the RAND reports of that time writes, is, I quote, the level of effort that the US and the international community have put into a democratic transformation. The level of effort, is the key that distinguishes success in Kosovo from failure in Afghanistan. And in this theory, of course, Bosnia was a very privileged international mission, very well resourced, 60,000 troops in 1996 for a population of less than 4 million people, 2,000 UN police observers, and a donors conference raising billions of dollars in reconstruction assistance. Now, the planners warn that because the resource requirements are high for success, missions in big places, in big countries, are likely to be difficult and costly. Intervention is more likely to succeed in small places, like Bosnia. The planners also say that if you have less resources, it is important to adjust your objectives. Less inputs, expect less outputs. But fundamentally, if you have to succeed, if you must succeed, there always is a way forward. And that is to increase inputs. In other words, to surge. The RAND Corporation reports criticize the Iraq intervention, particularly at the beginning, pointing out that there was a big gap between the ambitions, which were extensive, the lack of debate prior to the intervention about the difficulties, and the resources which were mobilized. Iraq, James Dobbins put it, ignored the lessons from Bosnia and former Yugoslavia. But what is more interesting today is to look at the relationship between the planning school's assumptions and Afghanistan. Because after all, in Afghanistan in the early years, a light footprint did produce some success. But many people argued that if only in Afghanistan from early on more resources would have been put in, state building in Afghanistan would have also worked much better. And this assumption was, of course, in the background of the surge, military and civilian, of the Obama administration. The theory here being that in Afghanistan too, if you want to succeed in the intervention and in state building, what you essentially need to do is deploy more troops and spend more money. Now, the second school I would like to discuss are the liberal imperialists. This is another way of thinking about intervention and drawing lessons from the Balkans. For the liberal imperialists, and the most prominent representative of this school that we discuss in the book is Paddy Ashdown, the former High Representative in Bosnia-Herzegovina, who also wrote a book about this experience and what it means for intervention. The core idea that Paddy Ashdown and others present is that you need to make a long-term commitment, that you shouldn't plan to stay for months or even years, but as Ashdown put it, stay for decades if needed. You also need to have a very particular type of plan. You need to have holistic plans. It's not enough to have a plan just for parts of the intervention. You need to have a plan that involves public administration reform, judicial reform, the rule of law. And if you can get away with postponing democratic elections, try to do so. Get away with it for as long as possible, so that in the interim period, with draconian, extensive international powers, you can both confront spoilers and warlords, and lay the basis for an effective and stable political system. Now, in this theory, there is actually something to be learned from the colonial experiences of the past. And there is a lot to be learned from a particular narrative of what happened in Bosnia. For liberal imperialists point to Bosnia as an example where it was only once the international community received extensive powers from 1998 onwards that success became possible. There is the story of a small town in northern Bosnia, the town of Brčko, which had 70,000 people and where by 1999 some 900 US soldiers were based, as well as an international protectorate with a supervisor who had unlimited powers to govern this district of 70,000 people. In Brčko there were no elections. In fact, the elected bodies were suspended and dissolved. All laws were imposed. All civil servants, all judges, the mayor, the prosecutors were dismissed and reappointed by the international supervisor. And by 2003, the year of the Iraq invasion, the New York Times, for example, would write that Brčko was, I quote, a remarkable success story with lessons for nation building in Iraq. Or as another analyst put it at that time, what you need for success in nation building around the world, and what Brčko shows, is that what is required is a whip and some cash, authority and money. Now both schools, the planners and the liberal imperialists, are in fact very optimistic. Not so much about the countries where we intervene, but about the international community. They both admit that it is hard to do interventions right, but if we want and if we must succeed, not only in ending wars, but also in building states, we, or the United States and its allies, know what it takes. We have the knowledge, we can mobilize the resources, and since what we do is inherently good, since people in Brčko or Baghdad or Afghanistan fundamentally share our values, we also have the legitimacy. So what is wrong? What is even dangerous about these grand theories of intervention? What is wrong about the liberal imperialism as applied by Paul Bremer in Iraq, or the planner's approach, which is combined with counterinsurgency strategy today at the heart of the international policy in Afghanistan, the belief that we can succeed if only we mobilize enough resources? At the core of both theories are assumptions about the international community, about its knowledge, its power, and its legitimacy. And it is in fact useful to contrast the myths about what was done in Bosnia with the reality, and to then arrive at some more modest assumptions about what the international community is capable of doing and achieving. So let me make a few points to suggest a more realistic way of thinking about intervention, about what worked in the Balkans and what might work elsewhere in the future. Now first, on the intervention itself in 1995, which ended the war, what we saw in the Balkans was a very effective use of air power to tip the balance. And combined with the willingness to negotiate with all sides, including sitting down with evil people like Slobodan Milosevic in Belgrade, air power was able to tip the balance in favor of the ground forces of the Bosnian government and the state of Croatia, which managed in that summer to put the Bosnian Serbs on the defensive. They lost almost 20% of the territory of Bosnia which they held. The Bosnian Serbs were expelled from Croatia. All of this combined to make the Bosnian Serbs and Slobodan Milosevic willing to plead for peace. Now this offensive by the Croats did involve war crimes, and the general in charge of it was later sentenced to more than 20 years in prison. So this was actually not a clean operation. At the same time, it allowed the United States to maintain faithful to its promise not to deploy ground troops. And in the end, it led to all parties sitting around the table and negotiate. Now, without the War Crimes Tribunal, there would have been, in fact, impunity for the crimes committed in 1995. Thanks to the War Crimes Tribunal, even the crimes committed at that moment by the army of Croatia finally were leading to prosecution. So the first point is that even then in Bosnia, the major lesson is that what the United States military was succeeding in doing was to tip the balance. It never assumed direct responsibility to go and win the war on the ground. Secondly, the relationship between inputs and risks post-war. It is true that there were 20,000 US troops and 60,000 international troops, but what is more important than the number was their mandate. And the mandate of these troops was, in fact, from the outset extremely limited. Troops were not sent to Bosnia to fight. This was very clearly spelled out not only by the US generals, but also by President Clinton. And in fact, by 1996, the New York Times noted that it was safer to be a soldier, a US soldier in Bosnia, than to be a US soldier in the United States. And the major injury that army soldiers were treating for the US military based in Bosnia were sports injuries. Should the US have done more in 1996? Should the military have taken more risks? It, at the time, to many people like myself who was in Bosnia, very clearly seemed as if the US was not taking enough risk, that it was erring on the side of caution. This is probably true. But what in the end matters was that because there were no casualties, the mandate could be prolonged. There was no big debate prolonging the presence of US troops, and slowly and incrementally the objectives that the international mission set out to achieve were in fact achieved. Now, that also means that it is impossible to extrapolate from Bosnia for completely different situations and experiences of nation building under fire. When there is an insurgency, the situation immediately is completely different from the one in Bosnia. And the reason Bosnia worked was not necessarily because there were 60,000 troops, but because these troops actually acted on the basis of a peace agreement agreed by all sides, and for a very long time gave a false sense of confidence to the wartime leaders that they were in fact safe and did not need to confront the troops at risk to themselves. Now, there isn't actually a good example for nation building under fire, US-led, succeeding. The one obvious experience in the 20th century, which is not included in the RAND case studies, is Vietnam. But as anybody, and as I discuss in my essay, as anybody who goes back to the debates on Vietnam will quickly realize, at that time there was a big debate inside RAND where there was no consensus at all what needed to be done to succeed in nation building. It is not actually that easy to arrive at concrete lessons. Now, my third point is one on conventional wisdoms in these experiences that we derive from the past. One very popular conventional wisdom from the Balkans was that you shouldn't have too many elections, or that you should not have too early elections. That elections absorbing a lot of resources might actually be counterproductive, legitimizing the wrong people, polarizing society. Because in Bosnia, the elections in 1996 were in fact won by the three main nationalist parties, which was, of course, particularly worrying in the case of the Serb, Bosnian Serb SDS, at that time still effectively controlled by Radovan Karadzic, later indicted and put on trial as a war criminal, and the party responsible for most of the ethnic cleansing in Republika Srpska, the Serb entity of Bosnia. But were elections really as disastrous in Bosnia as was later argued? Well, in fact, it was at elections in 1997, only 2 years after the end of the war, that the very party Radovan Karadzic had created and still controlled, the Bosnian Serb SDS, lost control of the entity it had tried to create. It was at local elections in 1997 that the displaced across Bosnia, who were able to vote, even though they were not in their old homes anymore, could express very powerfully their will to return. It was also elections which, combined with the International War Crimes Tribunal, first gave a false sense of confidence to nationalist Serb leaders, but did not actually lead to impunity. Because one by one, some of these leaders were picked up later as indicted war criminals. Investing in the machinery for elections in a complex multi-ethnic country, an effort that took many years and involved a lot of work by the OSCE, in the end also paid off, to the extent that today Bosnia, despite its polarized politics and many weak institutions, is in fact capable, and has been for many times now, to organize its own credible elections. So the lesson from Bosnia, that elections serve to polarize the politics and strengthen the warlords or those with an obstructionist agenda, this conventional wisdom deserves to be questioned. In fact, it very much depends, and this will be true for other interventions, on the specific context and on the specific expectations of those who organize elections. A fourth point is on where we learn lessons that are relevant for policy making. Most of the important lessons that involved successful implementation of the peace agreement in Bosnia were in fact learned in the field. And this is not surprising, but has profound implications for planning. Now, much of the information that would have been needed to draw up a plan, for example, how to carry out refugee return, was simply not available in 1996 outside of Bosnia. Even the lead institution that was charged with carrying out a massive and very ambitious project of allowing almost 2 million people the right to choose whether to return or not, and if they chose to return, to repossess their property. An unimaginably ambitious and unprecedented commitment, which was there in Dayton as a core value of the peace agreement. The key institution in charge of all of this, the UNHCR, had just had an experience of a few years in which they had pleaded with nationalist leaders to allow them to extract people, to protect them by taking minorities out of dangerous places. And UNHCR, understandably, was not absolutely convinced that without strong military support, which was not there in the beginning, it would be possible or even responsible to put a lot of resources into refugee return. In fact, it took a while to build a consensus among international organizations that this very important value could be realized. And it took the discovery of the strong will of Bosnians of different ethnic groups who actually pressed to return, and their willingness to assume the risk to convince the international community that this was something that could work. There was a lot of learning in the field. There were a lot of field officers who learned how to negotiate return on a village-by-village basis. There was a lot of planning that was involved on that level, and the setting up of an administration of the international community that could handle refugee return also took many years. There was the patience, however, and in the end there was the success. But the risks were assumed by the returnees. They drove it, and the international community followed their flow. Now, the fifth point, besides the fact that most of the lessons that we needed to learn, most of the knowledge that we needed was actually learned about in the field, is that we also only learn slowly about the strength of our own instruments. The international community often doesn't actually know how effective the tools are that it possesses. One example, in Bosnia and in the Balkans, is the International War Crimes Tribunal, the ICTY. It cost in the end an enormous amount of money, almost $2 billion from its creation in 1993 until today, and for a very long time it looked like a weak instrument. It didn't prevent the massacre in Srebrenica. It didn't seem to be able to go after the real culprits, the leaders of Serbia, of Croatia, of the Bosnian Serbs. But in the end it turned out to be not only extremely important, but perhaps the most important instrument of all. Now, there was a lot of learning in the field again, incremental learning. Sealing the indictments, not announcing who was indicted, made it easier to arrest people. Once people were arrested, others would flee, opening the door for refugee return and restoration of property. There was a lot of learning about how to most effectively put pressure on regional governments, Croatia and Serbia, to cooperate with the court. But most importantly, the ICTY helped win the battle of ideas by discrediting nationalist heroes and nationalist wartime leaders in the eyes of the international community and of an important and growing part of the local population as criminals. Refugee return, on the scale that we saw, and demobilization without violence for more than a decade would probably have been impossible without the ICTY. But very few people in 1993 could have predicted this, or would have predicted that it would be worth spending almost $2 billion on an international tribunal that in the end has lasted more than 17 years already. My last point is about the regional context. As we have seen in the case of the ICTY, Slobodan Milosevic and some of the major Croat leaders involved in the war would never have been delivered to justice and to the tribunal without changes in the neighboring countries of Bosnia, in Croatia and in Serbia. This was crucial, and this occurred many years after the conclusion of the peace. In 1999, Franjo Tudjman, the wartime president of Croatia, died. In 2000, the leader of Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic, was overthrown. This profoundly transformed the region. It allowed the European Union to make an offer to all the countries of the region that if they carried out reform and improved bilateral relations with their neighbors, they would have the promise and perspective of perhaps joining this prosperous club of European democracies, the European Union. This did produce enormous leverage, which allowed the European Union to, for example, get Croatia to deliver all the people that were indicted, including some senior generals that were indicted by the Hague Tribunal. It also changed what was possible inside Bosnia. So as the regional context changed, it was possible, for example, to merge the three armies which had existed at the end of Dayton. Now, this couldn't have been predicted, but as the region changed, it was responsible to increase our ambitions. The mission could do things, pursue things at low risk, which would have been impossibly risky right after the war. Now let me sum up. Let me conclude by saying that we always know less, and we knew less in Bosnia than we needed to know for an ambitious mission. Some of what we didn't know could be learned. This is an argument for staying for a sufficient period of time. It is an argument for persistence, but it is also an argument for prudence, for not running excessive risks. This was certainly the way refugee return was handled. There were setbacks, but at any stage there was a never-ending, tireless effort by a lot of international field officers, and above all, the determination of Bosnian displaced not to give up and to find out and manage in as responsible a manner as possible return to different places. This argument for being prudent also suggests that another conventional wisdom is likely to be wrong and even dangerous. The idea that the key moment to change things is right after the intervention begins. Now there is this idea that there is a 0 hour, a moment in which a society like a hot iron can be easily struck and bent and shaped and formed. In reality, it seems, however, that this illusion of a society that can be easily transformed by outsiders in these early moments reflects above all the international ignorance in these early moments about what is actually there. In fact, the more you learn about a society, the more you identify opportunities to bring about change in alliance with local forces. And identifying those opportunities in a concrete place at a concrete time requires a strong field presence, learning from local people, finding out what they think, and in this context, elections are actually a very important tool. Now, what about the lessons about international power in Bosnia? The idea that everything started to go well when an international institution, the OHR, the Office of the High Representative, was given these powers at the end of 1997. Is this a noteworthy innovation that could be applied elsewhere in Kosovo or Afghanistan? Well, in fact, some things that were achieved by imposing laws were very important. Property laws that allowed restituting property. Some institutions were imposed, some leaders were dismissed. But OHR was a curious institution. When Penny Ashdown, who used these powers most extensively, arrived in 2002, there were in fact only 12,000 troops left in Bosnia, no longer 60,000, and 2 years later all US troops had gone. In addition to that, he never controlled the troops and didn't have a prison. There was no Abu Ghraib in Bosnia. This meant that when a decree was issued, local parties were often free to ignore it. And if they did not ignore it, it was usually for one of three reasons. Either because there was silent consent, which means that there was already negotiation. Local parties agreed on something and found it more convenient for it to be imposed. Or there was a fear of the War Crimes Tribunal, which meant that Bosnian Serb leaders in particular, when confronted by the High Representative and not understanding how the court worked, were always careful and prudent and did not want the confrontation for fear of drawing attention to themselves. Or thirdly, there was a local power struggle inside an ethnic group, inside a political party, where an action by the High Representative could tip the balance in favor of one group or the other. Now, this vision of imposition as something that again worked on the margins, that looked spectacular but in fact required a silent consent, also suggests why it is so dangerous and misleading to take the model of Britschko or the Bonn powers and think about applying it in Baghdad or other places in the world. Or to suggest that what really holds Bosnia together today is these Bonn powers of the High Representative. This seems to be a dangerous illusion. Liberal imperialists also risk making an argument not for intervention, but for empire. If it really takes decades to stay on the ground with protectorate powers, if it really takes that long to remove all root causes of possible conflict, one might well conclude that these kind of missions are unachievable in most of the world. When in fact, as I argue in the book, this reflects a distrust of Bosnians and a fear of and a sense of dangers which are unrealistic and not justified. Now let me conclude on a modestly optimistic note. Intervention can work. Planning does matter, but most of the information needed is context specific. The key is to have concrete and modest goals. Recklessness is dangerous, and in fact the biggest danger. And the regional context and legitimacy is central to success. There is a need to trust local leaders, and there is a need to be careful but confident, to proceed with clear principles but incrementally, to succeed in these missions in places about which initially at the beginning of any intervention the interveners necessarily know much too little, and yet try to have ambitious goals. It's not the goals that are wrong, it is the recklessness and hubris with which they have often been pursued that is the fundamental problem about missions that have gone wrong in the recent decade.